Hi, I'm Pat Murphy-Racey, SONY Artisan of Imagery. Today, the content of this video is going to be all about the three different 35mm prime lenses that Sony makes for full frame. And one little curveball I'm going to throw in there at the end, so stay tuned. What we're going to do is we're going to compare the lenses and their specifications first. Then I'm going to show you some photographs that I've made with each of them. And then I'm going to tell you kind of my favorite one of all of them at the end. So let's begin. So first, I'm going to talk about the lenses in order that they were made. And the very first 35mm prime that was made was released with the original A7 camera, which is the first full frame camera that Sony made. And it was a 35mm 2.8 Zeiss lens. So this lens was made, the first two lenses that they made that are 35mm in focal length were both in the partnership with Zeiss, where they were, where Zeiss is producing the glass and Sony's doing the assembly. So to Zeiss's specifications. The last one, the 35-1.8, is all Sony. So we'll kind of talk about that relationship. But the very first one is the 35-2.8 Zeiss lens. The second one is the FE 35-1.4 Zeiss lens. So same thing as the 35-2.8 in terms of the partnership with Zeiss. It's dual branded, Sony on one side, Zeiss on the other. And then the last one is the 35-1.8, which is only branded Sony, and it does not hold the G or the G Master status. It's just a regular old lens, and more kind of on the more inexpensive side of things, even though it's fast. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a very useful tool that Sony has on their website. They have a really cool tool for searching for equipment, especially lenses. And so let's take a look at that. So this is Sony's website, and again, if you just go to sony.com, you can select cameras and then roll down to lenses, and this is what's going to pop up. And there are a bunch of filters involved. Because I've got this box checked down here, 35mm full frame, it reduces the number of lenses from 92 to 55. So there are 55 products that meet that description of 35mm full frame or FE lenses. Over here, you've got price points, which is kind of nice if you're trying to shop and you're trying to figure out, well, I only have this much money and whatever. Over here, if you're more kind of an amateur or a, kind of a weekend warrior, this is kind of cool because it will kind of show you the type of photography you want to do, and you can actually punch one of these on or off, and it will give you the lenses that will fit that description of what that type of work is. But what I've found in the bottom is also there's a G lens, G Master, Zeiss lenses, prime lenses, zoom lenses, and macro lenses. So it's kind of a nice little thing. There's also an thing up here for converters and adapters. So as we scroll down here to the lower part, what I'm going to do is show you how to use a really cool tool, a compare tool. So here's the 35mm 1.8. It's the most recent one. I'm going to check that. And then we're going to scroll down until we find the 35-1.4 and the 35-2.8. So we're just going to kind of cruise down here until we find those two lenses. Here's the 35-2.8. We're going to select that. And right next to it is the 35-1.4. So we're going to basically be able to go now just look at only these three lenses, and all I'm going to do is hit compare now. It's a really cool tool. So now it brings up the three lenses next to each other, along with the prices and their descriptions, which is very useful. So basically what we have is the 35-1.8 at $750, the 35-1.4 at $1,600, and finally the Sony, the 35-2.8 Zeiss at $800. Now, as we cruise down, we can see that they're all Sony E-mount, they're all full frame, they're all 35mm focal length. Just basically kind of roll down here. Now here's where we see the first change. So the 35-1.8 has 9 lenses, 9 groups and 11 elements. The The 35-1.4 has 8 groups and 12 elements, and the tiny little 35-2.8 has 5 and 7. So the angle of view is the same, all this kind of stuff, but one of the most important things we want to look at is aperture, so 1.8, 1.4, 2.8, and also minimum aperture. The super fast lenses don't always close down as far as we might like sometimes. So if you do a lot of like landscape work at 22, you're not going to be able to get to f22 with a 35-1.4. And this is kind of typical of how lenses are designed. The faster they are, the harder it is to make them close down and still be sharp. So because the weighting is all towards the front end of things where things are wide open. So basically you have also differences in aperture blades. So the two more recent lenses, the 35-1.8 and the 35-1.4, have 9 aperture blades, and the 35-2.8 only has 7. So this can change the way your flare looks, you know, when you get lens flare. They all have circular aperture, which is handy. That's nice. The 35-1.8 can focus down to 0.73 feet. The 35-1.4 can only manage about a foot. And the 35-2.8 is the worst of all of them in terms of being able to get close to things. You have to be at 1.15 feet away. So of all of them, the 35-1.8 is actually the best for being able to go very close to things. So if you like to do kind of macro work or look at flowers or fauna, you know, if you're out in the woods or in the mountains and you want to do something where you're still wide and you want to still see the background, kind of an environmental portrait, if you will, of a plant or a flower or something like that, the 35-1.4 will actually focus closer. So let's continue. Here's a big change that we see here, and this is filter diameter. So the 35-1.8 is at 55mm filter size. The 35-1.4 is huge at 72, and then we have a 49mm on the 35-2.8 Zeiss. Now here's where the most important thing is, I think, that we can look at, and that is the weight. So the 35-1.8 is 9.9 ounces. The 35-1.4 is 22.3 ounces, and the 35-2.8 Zeiss is just 4.3 ounces. So if you're a prime nut and you're rock climbing, you're backpacking for like a week at a time, this can be a big deal. This can really slant things towards the 35-2.8. It's tiny. It's so tiny it qualifies to be what's called a pancake lens, or a really, really tiny narrow lens. It doesn't stick out very far from your camera. So each of them have their own attributes in terms of specifications. But I think at this point what we should do is take a look at some pictures that I've actually made with them. So what we're going to do first is we're going to start with the earliest one, which is the 35-2.8. Now this is shot in an aircraft museum here in Tennessee, Beechcraft Museum. It's pretty cool. I needed to shoot something that showed this plane in the foreground, which is the model of this plane in the background. So I needed depth of field. The 35mm focal length is very good for keeping things normal, that is to say, not distorted. And so this was kind of a good choice for me to use. It worked out fine. You could see in the background, you know, the detail of the plane. You can see that it's the same kind of paint scheme, all that kind of stuff. So it worked out great. This is my son up in Oregon, where we did a vacation a couple years ago where we went to skate parks all up and down the West Coast. We just drove Highway 1. It was a gas, really fun. So this is the 35-2.8. We were traveling in a rental car every day, and I wanted to have a really small kit in my backpack, and that's all I had. And so basically the 35-2.8 was ideal for some of these skate parks. You can see that everything's sharp, but you can also see the background. You know, even though I'm far away from him, the background's not blown out of focus because it's not a super fast lens, even though I am at 2.8. And you can see here what I'm doing with my shutter speed. So this was shot at 8,000th of a second at 2.8 at 200 ISO. Now, that should tell you something. What I'm trying to do when I'm shooting at 8,000th of a second wide open in bright sunlight, I'm trying to do my best to blow the background out. And really, in this instance, I'm misusing this lens, but it's what I had. So my preference in my style of photography is to put the viewer of the image, I want to put you right on the subject and then let everything else fall away. And that is indicative of what like faster lenses do. And so the 35-2.8, you know, it's not the greatest thing for what I was doing with it here. Here I'm at 4,000th of a second at 2.8. This is my son Patrick on the Oregon coast. It is so gorgeous there. If you ever get a chance to go to the Oregon coast on vacation and spend some time, it is absolutely beautiful. It is so flawless. The scenery, the landscapes are just breathtaking. And as you drive up the 101 or the 1, you just want to pull over all the time to photograph the sea and the mountains and the trees, and it's stunning. So that's my commercial for the Oregon coast, and also Northern California, which is about the same. So back to this picture. Just note that I'm using a very high shutter speed so that I can have the lens shoot wide open. I point this out because when I use the 35-2.8 Zeiss, I'm usually misusing it. I'm almost always shooting it wide open. I'm pushing it all the way open all the time because I want to blow the background out of focus. If I had had the 35-1.4 on this trip, I would not have shot it at 2.8. I would have shot it at 1.4, maybe 1.6. So I really like this picture. I don't feel badly that I shot it with a 35-2.8, but I probably would have preferred if it was with a 1.4. And this is kind of my problem with the 35-2.8 Zeiss. I don't really enjoy that lens too much. I keep pushing it wide open, and I want to get a little further than that, and I can't get there, which is why Sony made the 1.4, which is great. So let's go back to the pictures. Here's another image that I shot with the 35-2.8. This is on another trip. This is over in South Carolina, and we're in a lighthouse building looking out at the ocean. And I just like the little clasp in the window, whatever. But basically, once again, I'm shooting the 35-2.8 Zeiss. My shutter speed is now 12,800th of a second at 2.8. So I'm really, again, I'm pushing this lens. You know, if it had been a 1.8, I would have shot at 1.8. If it had had 1.4, I would have shot at 1.4. So, you know, this is my issue with the 35-2.8. It's just not a lens that kind of produces the images that I like to make in the photography style that I have. Now, this may be not the case with you. And if you're a landscape shooter and you shoot at f11 and f8 and f16, the 35-2.8 is a tremendous lens. It's extremely sharp, and it will do a great job in that role. But if you're constantly shooting at 2.8 all the time, even with your zooms, it may be telling you that you may need to dip your toe into the primes, the faster primes. That was the last picture I had of the 35-2.8, and I had to go hunting for those images. I did not find them easily. That should tell you something too. I don't prefer the 35-2.8, and to be honest, I bought the lens because it was the only 35 prime that the Sony made back in the day. But once they made the 1.4 and I got hold of it, I almost never used that lens. In fact, I only used it pretty much on vacations and on one assignment where I got paid. So that should tell you something too. But anyway, so now we're going to go into 35-1.4. I have a lot of pictures I've shot with that because it's a tremendous lens. It's extremely sharp, especially wide open at 1.4. So let's take a look. So this is shot at f2 with the 35-1.4. You might say, well, you just told me all that stuff about shooting wide open. Why didn't you shoot wide open on this? And the fact is that because these three people are next to each other, they're very close, but they're not in the exact plane of focus. And so it's important when you shoot people wide open, when you have multiple people, unless you stage them exactly in the place they need to be, to keep that focus, it's dangerous. And so I shot this at f2. Now I'm shooting a single person. This is a lawyer out overlooking downtown Knoxville where I live. And notice that her face is turned slightly away from me. So it's like she's not looking straight at the camera. That makes me a little nervous. Even though I've got a 35, you know, technically a wide angle lens, I'm actually going down to 1.6. So I went a third of a stop, closed from 1.4, just to make sure I had both eyes sharp, and that worked out fine. So next image is the 35-1.4 shot at 1.8. I think here I was just shooting a high-speed sync, and it just worked out to be the right exposure, and there really isn't much of a background anyway. These trees are completely blown out of focus, and this is already out of focus even as it leaves the frame, so I was doing, you know, IAF and all that stuff. But again, 5,000 of a second, nearly wide open. This is a series I did on some lawyers from Tennessee for a law school, and you can see here that this is the 35-1.4 at 1.4, and you know, he's looking good, and he's got this incredibly complicated background that involves shiny cars, all these building facades are different colors, trees. It's just a complicated mess. But with the 35-1.4, you turn a mess into something beautiful. And that's why I love to shoot these primes wide open. It's just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous look. So here's another frame of the same gentleman. I'm getting even closer to him now, and I'm still at 1.4. And look at the difference between the background when I got closer. So this brings up a very, very important point, and that is that a lot of people think that depth of field is controlled solely by the aperture of the lens, and that's not correct. There are three things that affect depth of field, and that is subject to camera distance is number one, number two is the focal length of the lens, and number three, in last place, is the aperture. But this is a great example, this image here. Here I am far away, wide open, but when I move in closer, look at the difference between the two frames. And this shows that that subject to camera distance is really paramount. So what does this mean for you? If you're shooting a lens, like maybe you have the trinity of zooms in Sony, and you are using the 24-70 on a portrait, and you really wish that you could get more stuff out of focus in the background. If you can get closer to the subject, even if it means widening out a little bit, you will blow that background out more. So just a little tip for you. Moving on. Here's a 35-1.4 at 2.8, outdoors with high-speed sync flash. Again, there's lots of faces in here. There's 5 people in this picture, and one of them, this guy in the foreground, is really closer than the others by kind of a lot. So I closed down to 2.8, but again, I'm at high shutter speed, 1600th, sync and flash. This is where the 35-1.4 really shines, is when you get into some really super complicated environment where you want to simplify things in the background and make the reader look at your subject only. And so by looking through things, these are a bunch of hoses and stuff that are going down to like beakers and stuff, and I was shooting this girl doing samples from something. And again, this is 35-1.4 wide open, 6/40th of a second, 1250. And here's another frame that was shot of her lab partner. And it's a very complicated background. You got this like French fry heat lamp over here that's going crazy, and there's like cords and beakers, and there's stuff in the background. There's a door back here. But all the stuff kind of gets washed away by the 1.4 and the combined effect of being very close to the subject. So close that I can barely even see the sample she's taking in the little beaker that she's working with. So this is where this eye is the only one in focus, and it's fine with me. I think it's a nice picture, and it's something where a graphic designer can lay type over here. They can do all kinds of things because the background is blurry, so it's very useful in lots of different ways. This is an environmental portrait I did of a graduate student at a university who was a music major and was getting ready to do her final performance for her master's degree. And the 35-1.4 was perfect for this, and I really liked her look. She had the cool glasses and this long hair and these red seats and the piano. So this is like a 3-light portrait that I chose to shoot at 1.6 aperture. And I was moving a little bit, and I do a little English on the camera, and just to give myself a tiny bit of safety margin. Back then this was shot with A7R2, And the A7R2 did not have the same lockdown focus that the A7 III, A7R3, and A7R4, and of course the A9 have. So sometimes when I'd shoot that thing and I was kind of shooting fast and loose, I would, use the 1.6 instead of 1.4. But nice picture. I really like that one. And now we're going to enter into a bunch of pictures that I've shot fairly recently with the 35 1.8 Sony lens. So this is the first 35mm prime that Sony's made that's not been branded dually with Zeiss. But one thing I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed it too, is that the last lens to be released that was a launched lens that was branded Zeiss was the 50mm 1.4. Now that lens didn't come out until spring of 2017. So that's like 3/4 of a year plus, so you got 17, 18, 19, and 2020. I'm not sure what's happening, but it appears to me, and this is not any inside information, this is just me looking at the lenses that they've released. We've not seen a Zeiss branded lens launched in a long time. And it appears to me that what Sony's doing is they're now making sort of their own level of 3 levels of lenses. There's the normal lens, which is the 35 1.8 is one of them. Then there's the G series lens, and then the G Master on the very top. So I'm not sure if we're ever going to see another lens branded by Zeiss or not, but we'll see as time goes on. So here's some 35 1.8 images. This is from a senior shoot. Look at my shutter speed and my aperture, 6400th of a second at 1.8. Once again, 1.8 indoors. This is another senior shoot. I love doing the senior shoots. It's so much fun working with the kids. They're so creative. I always ask them, what their ideas are, and it's fun to they're fearless, and so they'll do whatever. It's kind of cool. This is from a magazine assignment I did just 2 weeks ago. Again, 2,000th of a second at 1.8, 35mm. One light portrait outdoors with high-speed sync. This is another senior shoot. This is a senior from a local high school. He was telling me all about this great play that ended a game in which they beat the #1 team in the state, which turned out to be their only loss until they got to the playoffs. So we went down on the 20-yard line because he's telling me about the 20-yard line, so we went there. And the 35 1.8 was a killer lens because it let me see so much of the field, even the goalposts in the background, some of the school buildings, the trees, the sky, and yet all of that is blurred out because I'm shooting wide open. So it's really cool. Another environmental portrait. This is a professor from a university who is working very closely with his students in a grammar school. And again, I'm 100th of a second, 1.8, 35. Another senior shoot. This girl loved to dance, and so she was dancing with this kind of weird, iconic structure in front of her school that everyone will know that went to the school where this was, with the sky and stuff. And again, 4,000th of a second, 1.8. Again, another kind of a different high school, different senior. Their colors are obviously black and red, and all these posts are painted black and red going down this hallway. And it just made a nice picture of the bringing the school colors in to an area. This is the entrance to the school. So in 30 years, that school will probably still be there and look the same for her as it did when she was there. Another image, just here's we go, 8,000th of a second at 1.8, 35mm. It's like, what I love about this focal length is it gives me this background. Like I can see the football field, I can see the stands, I can see the weight training area, I can see the Central High School Bobcats. I can see all these things, including beautiful blue skies and the clouds and stuff. But the focus is obviously right here. It's on her face. And because the IAF, I'm always sharp, which is great. And the wind was really cooperating that day. This poor girl had this beautiful long hair. And anytime I put her in any position other than being, like in this one, she was having a hell of a time. This was a magazine assignment. I shot this for the University of Kentucky down in Atlanta. And again, I'm inside of a home. I'm in mixed lighting, so it's tungsten backlight. And then what I've done is I put quarter CTO in my light bank So I'm not quite matching the, I still wanted the warmth in the background, but anyway, the 35-1.8 wide open was perfect for this, and I used, notice my shutter speed, I'm down to 40th of a second. Just trying to keep the ISO low and the quality extremely high. So here we go, 2500th of a second, f2. Her face was not pointed right at me, so I didn't feel like I could do 1.8, so I shaved off a third of a stop of that speed and made sure both eyes were sharp, and they are. This is that same girl. She played soccer for her high school, and she really wanted a picture of herself in her jersey. And this is during coronavirus, so she's locked out of her field. She can't get to where she played all 4 years. And again, my shutter speed, 5,000th of a second, 1.8 aperture. This is one of the very first images I shot with the 35-1.8 when it first came out, and really liked the way this one worked. Just the blue sky looking up. There's not a lot of distortion in the 35mm focal length, so it's really cool that way. 3200th of a second, 1.8, 35mm, and notice my ISO is all the way down to 50. And that's helping me stay wide open and not have such a super high shutter speed. So I love the Sony cameras and how they can go all the way down to 50 instead of like getting bottomed out at 100 or 200. Enough about my pictures. Let's kind of pull it all together and talk about each lens. The 35-2.8 Zeiss is a fantastic lens, but it's expensive for the speed that it offers. But if the most important thing for your photography is packing light and small, then the 35-2.8 is the prime for you. It's great. To me though, I found that it was boring. I just couldn't make it zing. I like wide open lenses, and 2.8 for me just was not wide open enough. So I no longer own the 35-2.8. When the 35-1.8 came out, I pedaled it, and because now I have a second lens that's kind of small and lightweight. So there's the 35-2.8. I don't want to trash it because it's a great lens. It's extremely sharp. They don't put Zeiss, that little blue sticker on stuff, unless it's legit, and that lens is legit. So if like shooting wide open is not your thing, there's no reason to spend the money on the 1.4 or the 1.8. You should get the 35-2.8. Next, I want to talk about the 35-1.4 Zeiss. It's a tremendous lens. It's a gorgeous lens. I have a lot of friends of mine that lens is their favorite lens in their kit. That lens matches up beautifully with the 85-1.4 G Master or the 135. It's a killer optic, and wide open, it's tremendous. However, for me, I find that the 35-1.8, the most recent lens that Sony has branded themselves, gives me everything I need. And so kind of the end of this review is that I no longer own the 35-1.4. 1.8 is 2/3 of a stop difference from 1.4. So I've given up a lot. That's a lot. However, the tiny size of this lens, here it is by the way, it's itty bitty. I mean, it's this tiny little thing. I love this lens. And if you take the lens shade off, it's, you know, obviously even smaller. This lens is about the same size as the 28 f2, which is what I'm shooting this video with. For me, I'm getting older, and some of you younger folks may not have a problem hauling around that 35-1.4. But for me, when I want to blow that background to smithereens, I'm going to use a 135-1.8 G Master lens every time. Or I'm going to use the 85-1.4 G Master lens. Or even the 85-1.8. I mean, I'm going to use a 50-1.4. I'm going to use something else. So for me, I just love the 35mm field of view. It's great. It's like the true normal lens. I think, in my opinion, a 50mm is an intermediate telephoto for me. So I just love the 35-1.8, and the fact that it costs less than the 35-2.8 kind of makes me go, that is the best value there is out there. So for me, and for what I do specifically, the 35-1.8 is meeting all of my needs. It really is. And I really don't often reach for that 35-1.4. I don't want to carry it. I'm willing to carry the telephotos, but I don't want to carry wide that's that heavy and long and big. It just takes up a lot of room. And you know, as we fly around, as artisans, we fly all over the place doing assignments and giving talks and stuff like that and doing educational things. And there's a point where you just have to figure out, like, what bag am I taking on this trip and what is reasonable to put in it. And the 3518 is something I grab always instead of the 3514. Now, I never leave without the 13518. Again, I'm willing to carry the weight where it's really important to me. But for me, I am so impressed. I don't find that the lens is any less sharp than the two other Zeiss offerings in 35mm, but I really like it a lot. Now, I'm done talking about the full frame lenses, but there's one more 35mm lens that Sony makes that is Zeiss branded that I'd like to mention, and that is the 24mm 1.8 Zeiss lens. Now, this lens is not an FE lens. This lens is designed specifically for the APS-C lens. But sometimes when you're doing an industrial job, if you're in a factory or something like that, you need a certain focal length, but you've got to carry depth of field farther to show more, or to sort of show the beginning and the end of a product rather than just a little sliver of depth of field. And so I do reach for this lens at times. I bring it with me, and you might say, that's a 24, it doesn't make any sense. But when you put a 24mm lens onto an APS-C body, you get a 35mm field of view exactly. So this 24-18 gives me the same exact field of view as the 35 1.8, just gives it to me with more depth of field. So I do use this. I use the 24 a lot for video. It makes a lot of sense. It's very light and small. So really, in my mind, I still own two 35mm primes. Just one happens to be for APS-C, and one is the full frame FE lens. So as usual, I probably talked way too much about this, but all these lenses are not cheap. $700 is a lot of money. And so I'm hoping that this video is useful to those of you that are trying to figure out what your next prime lens is in this 35mm focal length. There are others that are making primes now in this focal length. In my estimation, the 35-28 Tamron, I've never shot it. It's very nice looking. It's big. It's a 67mm focal length, I think, filter. It's just not of interest to me. I don't want to repeat my experience with 35-28 again. Sigma makes some really, really nice, super fast lenses, but they're huge and heavy, and I don't know. I don't really prefer the Sigma. Some of the Sigma glass is wonderful, but the primes are just so massive and heavy. It just counts them out for me. So I really am satisfied with 35-18. You make your own decision, though. Some of you might really want to go and buy that 35-14 Zeiss. And others of you, you know, if you're doing a lot of backpack and hiking, if you're going out in the woods for 2 weeks at a time, man, the 2.8 is probably the lens for you. So thanks so much for watching. This is Sony Artisan Patrick Murphy-Racey. Please subscribe to my channel and share it with others if you found this useful. Have a great day.